A racist cop attacked a black woman in front of everyone in the courthouse, not knowing she was the judge. What happened to him left everyone shocked. Step back. You don't belong here. The officer's voice was sharp, commanding, dripping with entitlement. The hallway was crowded, filled with lawyers, clerks, and officers passing through, but no one paid attention, not yet. A black man was on the ground, his face pressed hard against the marble floor, his wrists twisted behind him as the officer's knee dug into his back. His cries were muffled against the cold surface, but anyone with a heart could hear the pain. She saw it. Get off of him. Now. The officer didn't even turn his head at first. He was used to people talking but never acting. But when she stepped closer, he finally looked up, only to be met with defiance. His jaw tensed. His grip on the man's wrists tightened. Who the hell do you think you are? He spat, rising to his feet. He towered over her, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the courthouse lights. You need to step back before I make you step back. She didn't move. You're using excessive force. Her voice was steady. Calm. Dangerous. You need to let him go. A smirk curled at the corner of his lips. You think you can tell me what to do? He took a step closer, then another, invading her space like a storm rolling in, dark and relentless. Listen, sweetheart, I don't take orders from your kind. You people always want to play the victim, always running your mouths like you know the law. But guess what? He leaned in, his breath hot with arrogance. Out here, I am the law. Her fingers curled into fists. He laughed. You're not even supposed to be here. This is a courthouse, not a welfare office. Unless you're here to clean up, I suggest you get the hell out before I throw you out. A few heads turned now. A low murmur rippled through the hall, a whisper of discomfort, of people sensing that something was off but too afraid to step in. She stood taller. Last chance, she warned, her voice sharper now. Let him go. His patience snapped. You don't give me chances. In one swift motion, he grabbed her arm hard, twisting it just enough to hurt, enough to remind her of his power. Gasps filled the hallway. The murmurs turned into stunned silence. But the officer didn't notice. He was too busy smirking. See? That's what happens when you don't listen. Maybe next time, you'll, then, he heard it. A voice. Firm. Authoritative. Cold. Officer. Let her go. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. And this time, people were watching. The weight of their stares finally made him hesitate. He looked around, something was wrong. Something felt off. And then, he noticed the way people weren't just watching. They were waiting. Like they knew something he didn't. His grip loosened, but it was already too late. Because in exactly 5 minutes, this officer's entire life was about to change. And when he finally realized who she was, it would be a moment he would never forget. What happened next left everyone in that courthouse speechless. And when the truth finally came out, no one saw it coming. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. If you're a black viewer watching this, know that you are valued, you are powerful, and you deserve respect in every space you walk into. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. This story, like many others, is a reflection of the injustices that still happen today, but also of resilience, justice, and redemption. Now, sit back and enjoy an intense and powerful story. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a jaw-dropping twist. Let's begin. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that existed in places where power was constantly being measured, tested, and, too often, abused. The polished marble floors reflected the sharp, hurried footsteps of attorneys, clerks, officers, and defendants, each moving with a purpose, each existing within the rigid walls of a system that claimed to uphold justice but often failed the very people it was meant to protect. The air smelled faintly of coffee, stress, and paper, a scent unique to courthouses, a blend of exhaustion and authority that lingered in every hallway. At the center of this world, unknown to some, feared by others, stood Judge Naomi Carter. Naomi was not just a judge, she was a woman who had carved her way into a system that was never designed for her. At 42, she carried the kind of presence that silenced a room without the need to raise her voice. She had learned, through a lifetime of struggle, that respect was not something given to women like her, it had to be demanded, earned, and sometimes, fought for. Born and raised in the heart of Atlanta, Naomi had seen firsthand what injustice looked like. It wasn't just the big, televised acts of racism, it was the subtle, daily indignities that chipped away at the soul. It was watching her father, a dedicated and honorable police officer, get passed over for promotions while men with half his experience soared through the ranks. It was the way teachers spoke to her in school, as if surprised by her intelligence, as if excellence from a black girl was an anomaly. It was the way her mother had to code switch at work just to be treated with basic decency. Naomi had taken those lessons with her when she stepped into law school, using every whispered doubt, every sideways glance, every dismissive remark as fuel. She had graduated top of her class, shattered expectations, and climbed her way up the legal ladder, becoming one of the most respected judges in the state. But even here, in the seat of power, she knew, some people still looked at her and saw nothing but her skin. That was the burden she carried. And today, it was about to be put to the test. Because today, someone was about to make the biggest mistake of their life. Officer Daniel Hayes had spent his entire career moving through the world with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences. At 38, with 15 years in the force, he carried himself with an air of untouchability, the kind of arrogance that came from years of getting away with too much. Daniel wasn't worried about things like accountability. He had seen fellow officers brutalize people and walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. He had heard the complaints filed against him, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of power, but none of them had ever stuck. The department protected him, covered for him, treated his behavior as nothing more than the necessary aggression of a man doing a dangerous job. He liked the fear. He liked the way people flinched when he walked into a room, the way they lowered their eyes, the way they knew better than to challenge him. So when he spotted Jamal Robinson, a 23-year-old black man, agitated and speaking too loudly in the courthouse hallway, Daniel's instincts kicked in immediately. It didn't matter that Jamal wasn't posing a threat. It didn't matter that he had every right to be frustrated. All that mattered was that Daniel saw an opportunity to remind someone who was in charge. "You need to calm down," Daniel said, stepping forward, his voice carrying the weight of a command, not a suggestion. Jamal barely had time to react before Daniel's hands were on him, gripping his arm, shoving him against the hard, polished wall of the courthouse corridor. The sound echoed, causing heads to turn, but no one, stepped in. Jamal's face contorted in pain, his breath catching as Daniel's knee dug into his back. His wrists twisted at an unnatural angle, the tight grip of the officer's hands forcing them behind him. "Hey, what the hell, man?" Jamal protested, his voice strained. Daniel pressed harder, his smirk deepening. "I said calm down," he repeated, his tone mocking, taunting, like he enjoyed watching the struggle. Naomi saw it all. She had been walking toward the courtroom, dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, not her robe yet, not yet the symbol of her authority, just a woman watching. And in those moments, Daniel didn't see her for what she truly was. He saw her skin, but not her power. "Get off of him," she said, her voice controlled, but with an undeniable edge. Daniel didn't even bother looking at her at first. "Ma'am, step back," he muttered, dismissing her as insignificant. "This isn't your business." But Naomi didn't move. "Officer, he's not resisting," she continued, stepping closer. You're using excessive force. Daniel finally turned his head, eyes locking onto her. And that's when the real mistake was made. He didn't recognize her. He didn't care to recognize her. All he saw was a black woman challenging his authority. And that was something he wouldn't tolerate. "Listen, lady," he said, his smirk widening into something dangerous, condescending. "I don't know what little social justice class you took, but out here, this is how things work. Maybe next time, you'll learn to mind your own damn business." He stepped toward her, towering over her with deliberate intimidation, daring her to challenge him again. Naomi held her ground. "Let him go," she said, this time, her voice colder. Daniel laughed. "You think you give me chances?" His grip tightened on Jamal. "See, this is the problem with you people. Always running your mouths, always acting like you're in charge. But out here, I'm the one with the badge. I'm the one with the power." Then, before anyone could process what was happening, before the tension in the air could snap, Daniel made his fatal move. His hand shot out, gripping Naomi's arm, yanking her back with force, his fingers digging into her skin. A sharp gasp rippled through the hallway. People froze. Not because of what had happened, but because they knew what Daniel did not. Something was wrong. The air had shifted. The weight in the room had changed. Daniel started to sense it, the way the whispers started, the way eyes were locked onto him, but not in fear, in something else. Something that made his stomach twist. And then, "Officer," a voice called out, firm, unshaken. Daniel's grip loosened. Because in exactly 5 minutes, his entire world was about to crumble. And when he finally realized who Naomi Carter really was, it would be too late. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The weight of what had just happened settled over the courthouse hallway like an invisible fog, pressing down on every single witness. Daniel still had Naomi's arm gripped tightly in his fingers, but for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an instinct, a primal reaction, the kind a predator has when it senses it might have just stepped into the wrong territory. Naomi didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, unshaken. Around them, people were waiting, holding their breath, anticipating something that Daniel was still too blind to see. His arrogance hadn't let him notice the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the unspoken warnings in the expressions of those around him. But Naomi saw it. She felt it. And for the first time that morning, she let a small, almost imperceptible smile touch her lips. "Let me go." Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of authority, of finality. Daniel's grip tightened, his jaw clenching. "You don't tell me what to do." A movement in the crowd. A rustling of papers. Someone clearing their throat. "Officer Hayes," a voice spoke up from behind them, this time sharper, more urgent. It belonged to one of the courthouse bailiffs, a middle-aged black man who had been watching the entire exchange with tense awareness. His eyes flicked between Naomi and Daniel, something unreadable flashing across his face. Daniel didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. His focus was locked on Naomi, still too caught up in his own self-righteousness to realize that his world had already started to shift. "You should listen to her," the bailiff added, this time louder, as if warning him. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't take orders from," Naomi leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough for only him to hear. "You have no idea what you just did." Daniel smirked, that cocky, practiced expression that had carried him through years of unchecked authority. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but I can promise you this." Then, a voice. A new one. A familiar one. "Judge Carter." The entire hallway seemed to exhale at once. Naomi didn't even blink. But Daniel? He froze. It was 1 second, a brief, fleeting moment where confusion wrinkled his brow, where realization started to creep in like a slow-moving tide. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see where the voice had come from. A woman, a prosecutor, stood a few feet away, staring at them with a look of shock and horror. She wasn't the only one. Several people in the hallway, lawyers, clerks, even other officers, were now whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between Naomi and Daniel, as if trying to piece together the impossible mistake that had just been made. Daniel didn't understand at first. He was still holding Naomi's arm, still processing the name, the title, as if the words didn't quite make sense. Judge Carter. Then, it clicked. His fingers loosened before he even realized what he was doing. His grip fell away completely, his hand dropping as if burned. Naomi took a step back, rolling her shoulder slightly, shaking off the lingering ache where his fingers had dug in. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Because everyone else was. The room had shifted. The very power dynamic had flipped in an instant. Where once Daniel had stood as the unchallenged authority, he was now exposed, vulnerable, his power stripped away by the weight of the realization crashing down on him. He had attacked a judge. Not just any judge. The judge presiding over the case in the courtroom just down the hall. His breath came short. His chest tightened. His mind was already scrambling, already trying to rebuild his footing, to find some way to turn this around, to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing this. Naomi turned slowly, tilting her head, finally allowing herself to meet his gaze. There was no anger in her expression. No outrage. Just something much, much worse. Disappointment. Officer Hayes, she said, her tone light, almost conversational, as if this were nothing more than a casual discussion over morning coffee. Tell me something. Daniel swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Ma'am, that young man you just put your hands on, she continued, gesturing subtly to Jamal, who was still on the ground, his body tense, his breathing uneven. What exactly was his crime? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. You were so sure of yourself a moment ago, she mused, tilting her head. So certain that you had the right to use force. I'm curious, was it his tone? His posture? Or was it simply that you didn't like seeing a black man stand his ground? The tension in the hallway was palpable. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in, trapping Daniel in the very same space he had ruled over so confidently just moments before. Naomi's eyes narrowed just slightly. You put your hands on me, she said, and for the first time, there was something dangerous in her voice. In front of an entire courthouse. Daniel took a step back. His throat worked around the words that would not come. Then, another voice. Judge Carter, should we alert security? It was the bailiff. The same one who had tried to warn Daniel earlier. Naomi didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the question linger, let the possibility simmer in the thick, suffocating air. Daniel's breathing was uneven now. Panic had started to creep in around the edges of his carefully constructed facade. Naomi finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath, as if considering her next move. No, she said at last. Not yet. Daniel's eyes snapped to her. Not yet. Those two words held weight. They weren't a mercy. They weren't a reprieve. They were a warning. Because something was coming. Something that would tear his world apart. He could feel it now, hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. The whispers had grown louder, the stares heavier. People were watching his downfall in real time, witnessing the unraveling of a man who had never expected to be held accountable. Naomi turned to the bailiff. Get Mr. Robinson some water and have a seat arranged for him in my courtroom, she said. Then, finally, she looked at Daniel once more, this time with a small, knowing smile. As for Officer Hayes, we'll deal with him soon enough. And with that, she walked away, stepping past him like he was nothing. Daniel stood there, frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Because whatever was about to happen next, he knew it was going to be bad. The air in the courtroom was suffocating. Not because it was hot, but because the weight of what was about to happen hung so thick in the atmosphere that it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Every seat was filled, every corner occupied by curious eyes, murmuring voices, silent judgments. The tension was a living thing, twisting and writhing between the wooden benches, stretching across the space between the prosecution and defense, coiling around the man who now sat in the defendant's chair, Officer Daniel Hayes. He was still trying to process how this had happened. Less than an hour ago, he had walked into this courthouse believing he was untouchable, believing that whatever issue had just unfolded in that hallway would be handled. That maybe Naomi Carter, Judge Carter, would be too concerned with her own reputation to make a real problem out of this. That maybe someone, somewhere, would step in and shield him, the way they always had before. But no one had. Not his superiors, who refused to look at him when he was escorted into the courtroom. Not his colleagues, who shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, silent. Not even the prosecutors, who now sat across from him, their expressions unreadable, but their intentions clear. For the first time in 15 years, Daniel was on the other side of the law. He clenched his fists under the table, his pulse hammering in his ears, his jaw tightening as he stared straight ahead. He refused to look at Naomi. But she was there. Sitting at the bench, in her robe now, her presence a wall of absolute authority. She didn't have to speak. The room spoke for her. The very existence of this moment was proof of what had been set in motion. And then, the voice that would seal his fate, Officer Hayes, you are being charged with assault, abuse of power, and excessive use of force against an unarmed civilian, the prosecutor announced, her voice steady, measured. We are also reviewing additional civil rights violations and pending complaints that have been previously dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Daniel's mouth went dry. He had heard those words before, but never directed at him. His gaze flickered to Naomi, finally, as if expecting her to intervene. To stop this. To say something, anything, that would indicate that this wasn't really happening. But she didn't. Instead, she met his stare with a calm, unshaken resolve. That's when he knew, there was no stopping this. This is insane, Daniel muttered under his breath, shaking his head. He turned to his lawyer, a man who had been assigned to him last minute because the police union had already started to distance itself. Tell them this is ridiculous. I was doing my job. His lawyer cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Officer Hayes, no. No, Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't actually be serious. She's doing this to make a point. This is political. You can't seriously, Officer Hayes. Naomi's voice cut through the room. It wasn't raised. It wasn't harsh. But it silenced everything. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her this time. She tilted her head, considering him, as if she were looking at a puzzle that had just been solved. You keep saying that, she mused. That you were just doing your job. She let the words settle for a moment before continuing. Tell me, Officer Hayes, was it your job to shove an unarmed man against a wall? Was it your job to ignore his rights? Was it your job to put your hands on me? Daniel swallowed, his throat tight. Because if that's the case, Naomi continued, her voice growing sharper, then I have to wonder, how many other people have you handled the way you handled Mr. Robinson today? How many others have walked away from you with bruises they weren't allowed to talk about? How many walked away at all? The courtroom was silent. Daniel's fingers curled into fists, his knuckles turning white. This is a setup. His voice was lower now, desperate, cracking at the edges. You're just trying to ruin me. Naomi exhaled, shaking her head just slightly. Ruin you? She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked onto his. "Officer Hayes, you ruined yourself." He felt it now. The finality of it. The way the walls had closed in completely. There was no way out of this. The prosecutor stood again, clearing her throat. "Your Honor, in light of recent events, and the overwhelming evidence, including multiple eyewitness accounts, we request that Officer Hayes be suspended indefinitely pending further investigation and that his firearm and badge be revoked immediately." Daniel's entire body tensed. "My badge?" The words left him in a breathless whisper. It was the only thing keeping him tethered to any sense of power, of identity. Without it, he was nothing. Naomi's voice was clear, uncompromising. "Request granted." The sound of the gavel cracking against wood felt like the final nail in a coffin. Daniel's breath hitched. He sat there, motionless, as two court officers approached him. One extended a hand. "Your badge and gun, Officer Hayes." For a moment, he didn't move. His fingers trembled as he reached for the only things that had ever made him feel in control. He pulled them from his belt with stiff, reluctant movements. The weight of the badge in his palm had never felt heavier. The officer took it from him. Then the gun. And just like that, it was over. Daniel's head spun. His hands clenched into fists on his lap. His chest burned with something he couldn't even name: rage, humiliation, fear. Naomi watched him for a long moment. And then, quietly, she said, "This is what accountability looks like." Daniel couldn't breathe. And as he was escorted out of the courtroom, past the very people who once feared him, past the eyes that now saw him as nothing, he realized one thing. He had spent his whole life believing he was above the law. And today, the law had finally reminded him otherwise. Daniel's legs felt like they weren't even his as he walked through the courthouse corridors, his breath coming short, his heartbeat an uneven hammering inside his chest. The weight of what had just happened, what was still happening, clung to him like an unbearable second skin. Every step he took felt heavier, slower, like he was sinking deeper into something he couldn't climb out of. The walls of this courthouse, once familiar, once places where he walked with confidence, now felt smaller, more constricting, pressing in on him as if they knew what he had done. And the people. The eyes. He could feel them. Every person he passed, clerks, attorneys, officers, civilians, they were all watching. Some whispered. Some looked away as if they couldn't bear to make eye contact with him, like he was contaminated, like he was something filthy. And some stared right at him, their gazes sharp, burning into him with the kind of satisfaction that made his stomach churn. Because they had waited for this. They had waited for the day Daniel Hayes would finally fall. The thought sent a new wave of fury pulsing through his veins, mixing violently with his humiliation. They were treating him like a criminal, like some thug getting paraded through the halls after a conviction. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He clenched his jaw so tight his teeth ached. His fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms hard enough to leave marks. He needed to get out of here. He needed to breathe. But then, "You finally understand, don't you?" The voice made him stop cold. Daniel turned, his pulse spiking, and there stood Jamal Robinson. The same man Daniel had thrown against the wall earlier. The same man he had humiliated without a second thought. And now? Now Jamal stood in front of him, arms crossed, face calm, eyes sharp. There was no gloating in his expression, no arrogance, no smugness. Just something deeper, something that made Daniel's stomach twist. Pity. It made him feel sick. "You got lucky," Daniel muttered, his voice low, his throat burning. He needed to regain control of something, of anything. "That's all this is. Luck." Jamal's head tilted slightly, his lips pressing into a line, and then he laughed. A short, humorless sound, filled with something that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Luck," Jamal repeated, shaking his head. You think this is about luck? He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Daniel's, his voice dropping just enough to carry weight. Tell me, Officer Hayes, do you think luck is what made you throw me against that wall? Luck is what made you shove your knee into my back. Luck is what made you put your hands on her. Daniel's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You didn't stop, Jamal continued, voice steady, sharp. You didn't hesitate. You didn't even think. And now you want to stand here and act like you're the victim. Like this is something that just happened to you. Daniel's jaw clenched, his breath coming in short bursts. You don't get it, he muttered. You've never been a cop. You don't know what it's like out there. Jamal's expression didn't change. You think I don't know what it's like? His voice held something dangerous now, something that made Daniel's skin prickle. You think I don't know what it's like to feel a cop's hands on me? To get shoved against a wall for nothing? To have my body handled like it didn't belong to me? Daniel felt something shift in his chest, something deep, something ugly. Jamal exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You think today was the first time someone like you tried to make me feel small? His voice dropped even lower, turning sharp, turning lethal. The only difference is, today, someone actually stopped you. The words hit Daniel like a fist to the ribs. His breathing was uneven now, his nails biting into his skin. Jamal watched him, his gaze unflinching. You spent your whole life believing that badge made you something, he said, his voice almost quiet now. What do you feel like now that it's gone? Daniel's heart pounded, but before he could even attempt to respond, a slow clap echoed through the corridor. He turned. And there she was. Naomi Carter. Standing at the end of the hall, watching him, her arms folded across her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were lethal. Daniel's throat tightened. His hands curled into fists again, but this time, it wasn't in anger. It was in fear. Jamal glanced between them before exhaling, shaking his head once more. I'll see you in court. And with that, he walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, his chest rising and falling too fast, his mind spiraling. Naomi stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor, slow and deliberate, each step a reminder that he had no control anymore. Daniel straightened his shoulders, trying to mask the fact that he could feel his world crashing down in real time. Naomi stopped just a few feet away, watching him, studying him. Tell me something, Officer Hayes. Daniel's jaw locked. He refused to speak. Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering him like he was some puzzle that had just been solved. You always thought the badge made you untouchable, didn't you? She took another slow step forward. How does it feel now, knowing that without it, you're just another man with nothing to hide behind? Daniel's breath was uneven, his pulse hammering in his ears. You think this makes you better than me? Naomi exhaled, shaking her head slightly. No, she said, her voice almost soft. But I think it makes you see what the rest of us have always known. Daniel said nothing. Naomi leaned in, her voice dropping low enough that only he could hear. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about power. And for the first time in your life, Daniel, you don't have any. His heart pounded so hard it made him dizzy. Because for the first time in his entire life, he knew, she was right. Daniel sat in the cold, sterile waiting area outside the courthouse chambers, his back pressed against the hard wooden bench. His hands rested on his knees, fingers lightly tapping, a nervous habit he had never acknowledged before. The weight of the day had finally settled in, heavier than he had anticipated. His badge was gone. His gun was confiscated. His career, his identity, had been ripped from him in a matter of minutes. The noise of the courthouse buzzed around him, but it all felt distant, like he was underwater, struggling to process everything that had just happened. He had spent years walking through these halls like he owned them, like he was part of the foundation that held it all together. And now, people passed him without a second glance. No nods of respect, no quick conversations, no acknowledgements. He had become invisible. The realization made his stomach twist. He had always believed that power was permanent, that once you had it, it couldn't be taken away. But now he saw what true power looked like. It wasn't about a uniform or a badge. It wasn't about who had the authority to make an arrest. It was about control. Influence. The ability to change the narrative. And right now, he had none of that. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and Naomi stepped out. She was calm, composed, as she always was, but there was a new sharpness to her gaze, a finality that sent another wave of unease crawling through Daniel's spine. He had faced angry suspects before, criminals who had spat at his feet, people who had hated him. But he had never faced a judge's judgment like this. "Follow me," she said simply. He hesitated for half a second before pushing himself to his feet. His legs felt unsteady as he walked behind her, his mind screaming for him to say something, to fix this, but he knew, there was nothing to fix. They entered her chambers, the heavy wooden door shutting behind them. The room was elegant, yet intimidating. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed with legal volumes. A large desk sat at the center, papers neatly arranged, everything in its place. The kind of space that commanded respect. Naomi stood near her desk, watching him, waiting. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse, barely holding together. "Is this where you tell me my life is over?" Naomi exhaled, shaking her head. "Your life isn't over, Daniel. But the life you thought you were entitled to? That's gone." His fingers twitched. "You think I deserve this?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you ever think the people you put your hands on deserved what you did to them?" His jaw clenched. "I wasn't, you weren't what?" Naomi interrupted, stepping closer, her voice cold now, sharper than it had been before. "You weren't brutal. You weren't unfair. You weren't abusing your authority." Daniel's throat tightened. "Because I've seen the reports, Daniel," she continued, her voice steady but filled with disgust. "I've seen the complaints. The ones that were dismissed before they ever had a chance to be heard. The cases where your name was listed, over and over again. People who said you mistreated them, who said you used your power to humiliate, to control, to intimidate." He shook his head. "You don't know what it's like out there." Naomi scoffed, crossing her arms. "No. I don't know what it's like to walk into a room and not be seen as an authority. I don't know what it's like to have people doubt me the second they lay eyes on me. To have my qualifications questioned, my presence challenged. You really think I don't know what it's like to fight against a system that was built to work against me?" Daniel's breathing was uneven now, his pulse thundering. "You never had to prove you belonged here," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "You walked into every room with the assumption that you deserved to be in it. And when someone didn't cower to your authority, you made sure they paid for it." Daniel's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. "I was just doing my job." Naomi's lips pressed together. "Your job was to serve and protect. Tell me, Daniel, who exactly were you protecting when you threw Jamal Robinson against that wall?" He had no answer. "Who were you protecting when you grabbed me?" His chest burned. "You weren't doing your job, Daniel," she said, her voice now laced with disappointment. "You were doing what you always do. Using your power to make people afraid of you." Daniel let out a slow breath, looking down at the floor. He didn't recognize this feeling in his chest. It was foreign, unfamiliar, suffocating. It was shame. Naomi watched him for a long moment before she finally spoke again. "You have a choice." His head snapped up, confused. "What? You think this is the worst it's going to get?" Naomi leaned against her desk, crossing her arms. "This is just the beginning. There are civil suits pending against you. More cases being reopened. The media is already running the story. Your name is about to become synonymous with corruption. You think losing your badge was bad? Wait until you realize what happens when the entire country sees you for who you really are. His breath caught in his throat. You can fight it, she continued, tilting her head slightly. You can try to play the victim. You can deny it all, say the system is turning against you. But we both know how that ends. You will lose. His jaw locked. Or, she said, her voice quieter now, more dangerous, you can do something you've never done before. Take responsibility. Daniel's stomach twisted. Admit it, Naomi said. Admit what you did. Apologize to the people you hurt. Make an effort to undo some of the damage. It won't fix everything. But it'll be better than going down as just another disgraced cop who never learned his lesson. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight, his body rigid. He had spent his entire career believing that he would never be held accountable. That no matter what he did, he would always walk away untouched, invincible. But those days were over. And now, for the first time, he was faced with a choice he had never had to consider before. Run from the truth. Or face it. Daniel sat in Naomi's office, his body stiff, his pulse erratic. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had inched closer, as if the very space around him was trying to squeeze him into a truth he wasn't ready to face. He had spent years walking through courthouses, sitting in interrogation rooms, standing in front of judges, but never like this. Never from this side. Never with the weight of his own actions crushing down on him. His hands clenched into fists, resting on his knees, his jaw tight as he forced himself to breathe, to not lose control. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to fight back, to claim that this was unfair, that this was an attack on his career, his reputation, his life. But the words wouldn't come. Not this time. Because there was nothing left to say. Naomi sat across from him, composed, steady, her presence commanding in a way that didn't need force or intimidation. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to glare, didn't need to do anything but sit there and let the weight of reality sink into him. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. You think if I just admit it, everything will be okay? His voice was hoarse, strained, like it was painful to push the words out. Naomi tilted her head slightly, watching him, measuring his words. No. But it's the only way you walk away from this with even a fraction of your dignity still intact. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head, but there was no amusement in it, just exhaustion, just defeat. Dignity? You think I have any of that left? Naomi exhaled slowly, her gaze steady. That depends. Are you about to sit there and tell me you don't regret what you did? Daniel opened his mouth. Stopped. His fingers twitched against his knees. The silence stretched between them, heavy, waiting. Because the truth was that he did regret it. He regretted grabbing Jamal Robinson, shoving him against that wall with too much force, feeling the power of the moment surge through him like an unshakable certainty. He regretted grabbing Naomi, thinking she was nobody, thinking she was just another person he could control. He regretted the way his own arrogance had blinded him, how he had assumed that no one would ever challenge him. And now, he regretted everything. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter. I never thought it would come to this. Naomi nodded slightly, leaning back in her chair, her fingers interlocking as she observed him. And that's exactly why it did. The word struck like a hammer to his chest. I thought I was just doing my job, he said, but this time, the words felt hollow, like he didn't even believe them anymore. Naomi arched a brow. Your job wasn't to hurt people, Daniel. But at some point, you convinced yourself that it was. His jaw clenched. It wasn't like that. Naomi's voice didn't rise, didn't waver, but it cut straight through him. Wasn't it? Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to push back, to defend himself, to say that he had done what was necessary, that the streets were dangerous, that someone had to maintain control. But was that really what he had been doing? Or had it all been about power? Had he let himself become the very thing he used to tell himself he was fighting against? His fingers curled against his palm, his nails pressing into his skin. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. Naomi sighed, shaking her head. That's the thing, Daniel. They always say that after the fact. His stomach twisted. You have a long road ahead of you, Naomi continued, her tone firm but not cruel. There are people who will never forgive you. There are people who will demand that you pay for what you've done in ways you can't even imagine yet. And you're going to have to live with that. Daniel looked away, his throat tight, his entire body tensed like a live wire. And what about you? He asked, his voice raw. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. What about me? You could destroy me if you wanted to, he said, his voice lower now, more uncertain. You could make sure I never work again. You could make sure I never recover from this. You could, Naomi exhaled sharply, shaking her head. The difference between you and me, Daniel, is that I don't abuse my power just because I can. Daniel's stomach clenched. I believe in justice, she continued, her tone unwavering. Not revenge. But don't mistake that for mercy. You will be held accountable. The question is whether or not you're ready to accept that. His breath came shallow. You think this is the worst it's going to get? Naomi said, tilting her head slightly. This is just the beginning. There are civil suits pending against you. More cases being reopened. The media is already running the story. Your name is about to become synonymous with corruption. You think losing your badge was bad? Wait until you realize what happens when the entire country sees you for who you really are. His chest tightened. You can fight it, Naomi continued, her voice quieter now, but no less sharp. You can try to play the victim. You can deny it all, say the system is turning against you. But we both know how that ends. You will lose. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, but there was no escape from this. Or, she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice softer now, almost dangerous, you can do something you've never done before. Take responsibility. His pulse thundered. Admit it, Naomi said, and her voice carried weight, pressing down on him, forcing him to face himself. Admit what you did. Apologize to the people you hurt. Make an effort to undo some of the damage. It won't fix everything. But it'll be better than going down as just another disgraced cop who never learned his lesson. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat aching, his hands trembling slightly. He had spent his entire career believing that he was the one holding the line. That he was the one keeping order, keeping control. That no matter what he did, no matter how hard he went, the system would always have his back. But now, the system had turned its back on him. And for the first time, he realized it had never really been on his side to begin with. His breath was uneven. His thoughts were tangled. His entire world had crumbled in a single day. Daniel sat motionless in Naomi's office, his body rigid, his breath uneven, as the weight of everything pressed down on him like a boulder on his chest. He had spent his entire career believing in the illusion of control, telling himself that as long as he had the authority, as long as he had the power, as long as he had the badge, he would never have to face a moment like this. He had convinced himself that his actions were justified, that his decisions were made in the heat of the moment, that his instincts had been honed by years of experience on the streets. But now, sitting here, stripped of everything that once defined him, he felt small. His hands trembled slightly as he curled them into fists, as if somehow holding on to something, anything, could keep him from unraveling completely. He could feel Naomi watching him, could feel the weight of her gaze on him, unwavering, unshaken, waiting. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't pressuring him. She was just letting the truth settle in. And that was worse than anything she could have said. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face, feeling the heat behind his eyes, the burning shame that clawed at his insides like something living, something hungry. You think if I just admit it, everything will be okay? His voice came out raw, strained, like the words were painful to say. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. No. But it's the only way you walk away from this with even a fraction of your dignity left. Daniel let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking his head, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. Dignity. That's funny. His voice cracked at the edges. You think I still have any of that left? Naomi exhaled slowly, her gaze steady. That depends. Are you about to sit there and tell me you don't regret what you did? Daniel opened his mouth. And nothing came out. Because the truth was like a fist lodged in his throat, refusing to let him breathe. He regretted everything. He regretted grabbing Jamal Robinson, treating him like he was less than, like he was just another problem to be dealt with, another name in a report. He regretted the way he had grabbed Naomi, the way he had assumed, without hesitation, that she was someone who didn't matter. He regretted the smirk he had worn, the arrogance in his voice, the way he had thought he could get away with it because he always had before. And now? Now, he regretted all of it. His voice, when he finally found it, was barely above a whisper. I never thought it would come to this. Naomi nodded slightly, her fingers interlocking as she studied him. And that's exactly why it did. The word struck him like a punch to the gut. I thought I was just doing my job, he said, but the word sounded weak. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Your job wasn't to hurt people, Daniel. But at some point, you convinced yourself that it was. His jaw locked. It wasn't like that. Naomi's voice didn't rise, didn't waver, but it cut through him like a blade. Wasn't it? Daniel exhaled sharply, his shoulders tense, his body betraying him. He wanted to fight back, to say that things weren't that simple, that the job was complicated, that no one understood what it was like to be out there, making decisions in the moment, trying to keep order. But none of those excuses mattered now. Because the truth was standing in front of him, and there was nowhere left to run. His fingers curled against his palm, his nails pressing into his skin. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. Naomi sighed, shaking her head. That's the thing, Daniel. They always say that after the fact. His stomach twisted. You have a long road ahead of you, Naomi continued, her tone firm but not cruel. There are people who will never forgive you. There are people who will demand that you pay for what you've done in ways you can't even imagine yet. And you're going to have to live with that. Daniel looked away, his throat tight, his entire body wound so tightly that he felt like he could snap. And what about you? He asked, his voice hoarse. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. What about me? You could destroy me if you wanted to, he said, his voice lower now, more uncertain. You could make sure I never work again. You could make sure I never recover from this. You could, Naomi exhaled sharply, shaking her head. The difference between you and me, Daniel, is that I don't abuse my power just because I can. Daniel's stomach clenched. I believe in justice, she continued, her tone unwavering. Not revenge. But don't mistake that for mercy. You will be held accountable. The question is whether or not you're ready to accept that. His breath came shallow. You think this is the worst it's going to get? Naomi said, tilting her head slightly. This is just the beginning. There are civil suits pending against you. More cases being reopened. The media is already running the story. Your name is about to become synonymous with corruption. You think losing your badge was bad? Wait until you realize what happens when the entire country sees you for who you really are. His chest tightened. You can fight it, Naomi continued, her voice quieter now, but no less sharp. You can try to play the victim. You can deny it all, say the system is turning against you. But we both know how that ends. You will lose. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, but there was no escape from this. Or, she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice softer now, almost dangerous, you can do something you've never done before. Take responsibility. His pulse thundered. Admit it, Naomi said, and her voice carried weight, pressing down on him, forcing him to face himself. Admit what you did. Apologize to the people you hurt. Make an effort to undo some of the damage. It won't fix everything. But it'll be better than going down as just another disgraced cop who never learned his lesson. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat aching, his hands trembling slightly. He had spent his entire career believing that he was the one holding the line. That he was the one keeping order, keeping control. That no matter what he did, no matter how hard he went, the system would always have his back. But now, the system had turned its back on him. And for the first time, he realized it had never really been on his side to begin with. His breath was uneven. His thoughts were tangled. His entire world had crumbled in a single day. And now, for the first time, he was faced with a choice he had never had to consider before. Run from the truth. Or face it. Daniel sat in the courtroom, his body rigid, his breathing slow and controlled, but inside, he felt like he was unraveling. The world outside this courtroom had already made its judgment. His name had been dragged through the news, dissected in endless debates, torn apart on every social media platform. His face had been plastered across articles that recounted his past complaints, his history of unchecked aggression, his moments of abusing power that had been dismissed, buried, or ignored for years. But there was no ignoring it now. This wasn't a news report. This wasn't another headline. This was real. For the first time, he wasn't the one standing with his arms crossed, watching someone else be judged. He was the one on trial, not just in the eyes of the law but in the eyes of everyone who had ever suffered under men like him. The weight of that truth settled in his chest like a boulder, crushing, suffocating, inescapable. Naomi sat at the judge's bench, her presence as composed as ever, her face unreadable. But he knew better now. He saw her differently. He understood what he had done, what he had assumed, what he had ignored for far too long. She wasn't just another woman in a courtroom. She was someone who had spent her entire life fighting for the kind of justice he had been blind to. He wasn't fighting anymore. There was no fight left in him. The prosecutor stood, addressing the court, listing every charge, every consequence. The room was silent, heavy, filled with people who had waited for this day. Some sat with their arms crossed, skeptical. Some leaned forward, watching intently. Some looked at him with contempt. And some, like Jamal Robinson, sat in the front row, their eyes filled with something more complex than hatred, something that made Daniel feel even smaller. When the time came for him to speak, he stood. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his fingers pressing into the wood as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing under the weight of it all. His throat was dry. His pulse hammered. But his voice, when it came, was steady. I was wrong. The room shifted. It was subtle, but he felt it. I spent years thinking that because I had a badge, because I had authority, I had the right to act the way I did. I justified my choices, told myself I was keeping order, keeping the streets safe, doing what had to be done. But I wasn't. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He kept going. I abused my power. I let my position protect me from consequences. And I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I let my own biases shape how I treated others, and I never stopped to question it because no one ever forced me to. Because the system let me believe I was above accountability. His hands curled into fists. He forced himself to look at Jamal. You deserved better, he said, his voice quieter now. I can't change what I did to you. I can't undo the way I treated you, the way I treated so many others. But I can say this, I was wrong. And I'm sorry. The courtroom was silent. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't speaking to defend himself, to justify, to excuse. He was speaking because he had no more illusions left to cling to. The ruling came swiftly. He was stripped of his right to ever serve in law enforcement again. His pension was revoked. Civil suits were already waiting. He would never work in any position of power again. And yet, as he walked out of that courtroom, surrounded by whispers, by eyes that burned into him, by the final realization that he was no longer the man he had once been, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt free. Naomi watched him leave, her expression unreadable. This had never been about revenge. It had always been about justice. She had spent her career fighting for moments like this, moments where the system that had failed so many finally held someone accountable. Jamal walked out of the courthouse with his head high. He wasn't naive. One case didn't fix a broken system. One man's downfall didn't undo years of injustice. But today, for once, someone who thought they were untouchable had been forced to answer for their actions. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And something was more than they usually got. Daniel's life didn't end that day. But it would never be the same. He spent the next few years trying to understand the damage he had caused, facing the consequences of his actions in ways he had never imagined. Some people would never forgive him. Some would never accept his apology. He didn't expect them to. But he didn't run. And that was something. So now I ask you, after everything you've heard, do you think people like Daniel can truly change? Do you believe in second chances, or do you think some mistakes are too big to be forgiven? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge perspectives and unravel the unexpected, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. See you in the next one.